Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Bridgewater Historical Society, and happy first full day of autumn. Wonderful weather too. Today, our program, we're going to be talking John Atwood, member of the Bridgewater Historical Society, longtime citizen of the town, someone who's had a deep interest in the history of our town. We'll be talking about the North Bridgewater burying ground and 225 years of history. John is also a organist choir director from the Congregational Church of Bradford in Vermont, and restores reed organs, among his other interests. And after the presentation and questions and such, all those who you're interested, we're doing a field trip to the North Bridgewater Cemetery itself. So with that, no further ado, I'd like to introduce John Atwood.
A nice pointer to point out pictures here. I offered to use the gun in the cabinet here. What I'm going to talk about, growing up in this township, you were part of different communities. Our community, North Bridgewater, was more connected with Prosper than it was with, they didn't even plow the road in winter. It tells you how connected we were with it. So my identity tends to go from North Bridgewater the other way. So I actually didn't know many people over here. What I'm going to talk about is the development of North Bridgewater Cemetery, and in the context of the early history of it, discuss evolution of gravestones, the decoration in the middle, the shapes of the tops, and also the epitaphs, which kind of reflects how people thought over many different years. My sources, probably the most important one, this has been rebound, is History of Vermont, Natural and Civical and Statistical by Betsy Thompson, written in 1842. He describes a bit of North Bridgewater and its settlement. Another source is the Childs County Gazetteer and Directory, compiled 1883 and 84. What this book tells you is a map at the end of it. It tells you who lived where. The roads were numbered, and it tells you, and not only that, it tells you what they did. Not that they always got the information right. We can show that sometimes they did not. I have a couple of sources from the Vermont Standard and Spirit of the Age, 1873, about the Shaw burnings. And I have a genealogy, which was provided by Jenny Shurtleff, about the Shaw family. It was compiled by Grace Jocelyn, who was a school teacher in the Corners School, and she was a descendant of the Shaw family. And lastly, I want to advertise for this. I think we only have 7 copies left of the Bridgewater, Vermont. This is the latest edition, 2005, and it has an addendum by her son, Tom Adams, which indicates all the information on the stones. So a brief historical context. There's a view of the cemetery as it looks today. Give you a little historical context. The first settler in Bridgewater was 1779. Asa Jones, he came to an area south of our valley. I'll call it, for lack of another name, the North Bridgewater Valley. And he was closely followed by Amos Mendel in 1780. And the son of Asa Jones, Abner Jones, wrote a piece about what they lived in and when they came, because they came to a, you might call it a wilderness. They were really just in the edge of the wilderness. I mean, Woodstock was less than 4 miles away. We were not in the deep wilderness. But what they built, wholly of logs, a temporary house, bark, boughs, and wooden pegs in the room of nails. The great plenty of wood was easily collected into a large heap before one end of the house, the greater part of which was open and set on fire. Thus it was kept day and night until the weather grew warm. They came in like March, late winter. Wasn't as cold, but the brooks were frozen. They could cross the brooks with their sleds. And this is the kind of a building that the settlers in our valley to the north built. 1782, Isaiah Shaw, Cephas Sheldon, and Elisha Gillett came to North Bridgewater to clear. And again, it was late winter when they came. And they stayed until fall. And two of the settlers, Cephas Sheldon, moved on to Stockbridge in about 15 years after. And Elisha Gillett remained in North Bridgewater. We're not quite sure where he was, but much of his land was acquired by the Shaw family. So since I grew up in the Shaw house, I know a little bit more about it. And what kind of forest did they come to? I remember when I was taking an ecology course at University of Vermont, Dr. Volman indicated that the beech forests were the common forests here. When the concept of a climax forest was more in vogue than it is now. And there's another source called Hands on the Land by Jan Albers, a very fine book, well illustrated. And she indicates that fall color when the colonists came was yellow because of the predominance of beech. And this is pretty much supported by what we see in the beams of the floor joists of the Shaw house. Out of 9 beams, 6 of them are made of beech. Nice straight beams. These things are going straight up. And also hop horn beam, alias Remen, Ostraya virginiana, very hard wood. And one was of yellow birch. The main hewn beams in the house appear to be made of hemlock, and that's based on the distribution of knots and also the large cracks in the wood. And some of the wide floorboards are also of hemlock. So it seems that the early part of the house, don't look at these are replacements much later. Those are circular saw marks on those beams. But it seems that they had access to a lot of beech, hemlock. There's no oak, and I would think that would have been the wood of choice for someone with an English culture. I'm sure that was the wood of choice in coastal Massachusetts, where our settlers came from. So, the settlers came, built these crude log houses. Our settler came in we returned to Massachusetts, 1782, married, and then brought her to Vermont to one of these crude houses of beams. My father once talked with Frank Shirtliff, who was born in 1783, and he pointed out where this crude log house was very long ago. And he could even remember the timbers. But Isaiah Shaw brought his wife to this. Now, all I can imagine, they might have had a burlap piece of cloth by the front door and a fire going in the back end of it. This is not comfortable lodging by any means. 1784, Zadok Thompson says the first sawmill in Bridgewater happened less than half a mile away from from this house. And Boyce, what was his name? George Boyce built the first actual frame house, 1785. So the Shaws had to be living in something. We don't have the date on this house. We are presuming that it's 1790 plus or minus 4 years, probably earlier. They had to live in something. So they were on the edge of the wilderness. Could probably get on a horse and go to Woodstock in a couple of hours. And this is the historical context for the cemetery, which was, they were originally called burying grounds. You go to Massachusetts and some of the old cemeteries are still called burying grounds. I remember in Gloucester, Massachusetts, there was the Bridge Street Burying Ground, very grim place. And underneath was all solid granite, so they were buried above ground, bricked up all around, and somebody would take off the top and throw the bones around. It was a little creepy. And anyway, this was called a burying ground. And it started out as a private affair. This is one of two very early stones. Next, please. Now I diverge a little bit. One of the very first people buried here, the grave was east and west. There's a lot to show in this one slide. The engraver had a little trouble with the date. He started with 19, well, he missed that. The engravers may not have been literate, you understand. Here's Isaiah, he missed the I, so he stuck it up here. Some of the early styles, otherwise it's beautifully done. There's an F and there's an S, and I defy you to tell me the difference between the two. Isaiah Shaw, of course. Now, the date. I have a genealogy here by Grace Jocelyn of the Shaw family, and the problem is her son was born May 11th, 1792. Now we have a problem here. I think but she also corrects this date as 1792 rather than 1791, which makes sense. I mean, her son born May 11th, she dies 11 days later, probably complications of childbirth. So we begin to understand that stone a bit more. Another early stone is Patience Perkins. She lived in a place developed just to the east of us. Her husband and she came in 1790. And, but her grave is the only one that's arranged north and south. It seems that they realized, well, maybe there's going to be more people buried here, so they better keep it well organized. So all the rest of the graves have an east-west orientation. Now, there are three things I'm going to talk about on these stones. One is the shapes of the tops. One is the epitaphs, and a little bit about the symbolism. I must say I don't really understand a lot of. These are a couple of angels here, and this is an urn in the middle. Can we go back to the last one, please? There we go. A little something about epitaphs and the evolution of them. This one is on the stone of Abaya Shah, the stone you just, 2 stones ago. And interesting epitaphs. They're kind of grim in the beginning. Behold and see as you pass by, as you are now, so once was I. As I am now, so you must be. Prepare thyself to follow me. That's probably a fairly well-known one. There's another one of David Montague, 1793. Nor age nor sex can death deny. Think, mortals, what it is to die. Just about as grim as they can get. We go on a little further. Ah, my young friends. No, here's yet another one of 1807. Death is a debt to nature due. I've paid this debt and so must you. Well, thank you for the reminder. And 1813, ah, my young friends, I once like you could stand such monuments to view, but with me here you soon must be, and others stand and read of thee. Yes, nice little reminders. But then, about 1816, the tone of these starts to look to the afterlife. Prepare, my friends, to follow me. Prepare, my friends, in time to flee into the arms of Christ thy Lord, where we shall share a rich reward. Things are changing. Jonathan Boyce, 1821. Sleep on, sweet child, and take thy rest. It is God's will who thought it best. A lot gentler than those first few that I was reading. Blessed are the dead which die in the Lord. That's 1846. We're getting a lot more religious now. Here's one of 1875. Not dead but sleeping sweetly on Jesus' tender breast. Her weary life works finished. Our dear one is at rest. And they get even more sentimental. He is past the pearly gates. Close behind the throne he waits. That's 1883. So we're done with the grim epitaphs that we see in the first 20 or so years of North Bridgewater. The imagery on the tops of the stones is, I talked to somebody, we don't see any what they call winged deaths. You know what I mean by winged deaths? It'll be an angel's head or something with a pair of wings on it. And earlier you'd see a skull there or some image of a skull with wings. And you'll see these in cemeteries down the Connecticut Valley. None in North Bridgewater. Our president, Polly Timken, loaned me a book entitled Graven Images. And in fact, there are some stones of 1800 in the Connecticut Valley with the winged death still, but not in North Bridgewater. We were spared those. Something about the tops of this tombstones. This shape is very frequent in the early stones. It's what I would call a Baroque shape. You see them abundantly in old pipe organ cases of Germany and the Netherlands and England. And it's carried over to the Americas. Here's a modification of that shape here. And this is another one of the Shahs. This is, I think, 1811. Did I put the date? Yes, 1811. The motif is the willow tree. This is a common theme in North Bridgewater Cemetery. Urn with a willow. The willow stood for the tree of life, as I understood from the book Graven Images. Another early shape. This is 1815, showing a little embellishment on the sides of the stone. This is Benjamin Perkins. This is Bridgewater's first doctor. And I remember Dad had asked Frank Shirtliff where he lived, and Frank didn't know. He said somewhere on the way to Bridgewater. So I guess it's somewhere on North Bridgewater Road. Captain Benoni Shaw, 1823. This shape is still retained. You've got a willow up here, and I'm not sure what these represent. It's trees of some sort. That shape is retained. Also, some of the earlier stones we see is just the native Waitsfield Formation stone, which Peter Thompson pointed out to me in North Bridgewater. This is in memory. Notice that the N is backwards. In memory of Mrs. Jerusha Cobb, 1795. And I don't know, the style of this looks to me to be the same as the guy who did the engraving on Patience, Perkins, and on Abaya Shah. But most stones thereafter are more refined. Now this is the husband of Abaya Shah. That's the first stone we were looking at. But he died in 1839. She died in 1792. Note how different the stone is. Top is just a bowed. There's a very different tree of life. And also, this is more sentimental, the inscription. Retire, my friends, dry up your tears, here I must lie till Christ appears. So he was thinking of the afterlife, but his poor wife, I don't know what happened with her. And there's Alfred. Now, he is one of the relatives of one of the three Gillets that, settlers that came to North Bridgewater Valley. And it's just a straight stone, just a square stone in beautiful condition. I mean, this has been here since 1811, over 200 years in the weather. And it's probably one stone in the best condition in the whole cemetery, including the granite stones. Okay, here we go we're now in the 1830s and 40s, and you get kind of the steeple clock shape. I'm not quite sure what that shape signifies. It was a change. Maybe it was a metaphor for the passing of time. Anyway, you see that quite a bit. Here's our old Baroque shaped tops of the stones. Incidentally, also those early stones sometimes had just a simple arch, like so, with a bump out on each side. And then by 1853, we got much more sentimental types of stones. The Gothic arch became a metaphor for Christianity itself. Also, if you look at the carving at the center, there are flowers. Looks like a pair of calla lilies at the very top. This is a pair of stones, husband and wife, died like 33 years apart. This is Charity, the church homes, the husband, and who knows, there may have been an interesting epitaph down below there. But the wife got a rectangular stone, and she died in 1859, much later. You still have the heart motif here in the middle of the urn. Here, the heart is encompasses a hand pointing upward. I guess that's where you would find Charity. Now we're going to go on and talk a little bit about the Thompson family. Sorry, Peter. I come back to Zadok Thompson's Gazetteer. Just think of, it's a very important volume to know for Vermont history. This is a story about an Atwood that lived in our place, but I was not related to him, but I knew him when he was much older. This is down below our orchard on a pile of stones. And look, note, there's BT there. And just take note of the style of that T. This is the guy that's responsible for that. He's a little rascally. His name was Irving Atwood, but his nickname Bill for whatever reason, I don't know. But he lived in that house. He was born on Wayside Road long ago. And it looks like someone who lived in my time, 50s, 60s. His sister he had a sister with a dog that died. And they decided they wanted a service for the dog. And so they had their service, but they needed a gravestone. And guess where they got it from? Well, we don't know, but that's the only place it's likely he got a stone from. So thanks to Tom Adams's compilation of all the gravestones in Bridgewater, I was able to go through it and find anybody with BTs. We come to Betsy Thompson. This is an ancestor of Peter Thompson. It's here. And look at the T, the style of that T. I don't have any doubt that that was a footstone that went with this grave long ago. We're talking about, that boy just looks so vibrant, so alive. There he is. And that's what happens to anybody who do things they shouldn't. And for that matter, when they do things they should. He was born in 1898. He died in 1980 at the age of 81. And here he is in North Bridgewater Cemetery. Anyway, it just brings a little bit of life to the tombstones. I'm going to switch to the Shaw family shortly. There were a series of arsons that happened in the late summer of 1873, caused by a descendant of the first of the Shaw that settled on our place. His name was Edward Shaw. And speak of mistakes that the newspapers make. The newspapers had his name wrong. They had him as Edwin Shaw, but all other sources say it was Edward. And he he exhibited some pretty strange behavior before he started setting fire to buildings. For one thing, when he would come to eat with his family, he would bring a gun to the table with him. He didn't trust anyone. He took his sister to the normal school in Randolph. Normal school was a teacher's school. And on his return, he heard a train engine whistle 3 times, and he is said to have said, "And that's when I knew the 3 men were after me." And so it was shortly thereafter he became agitated, and his father, who lived there, conscripted a couple of neighbors to help keep him in the house, keep him without leaving. And but he escaped. He is said by the newspaper indicates he escaped out an open window and down the wheat field. Wheat field? They grew wheat, apparently. And down the road and over the bank. And I know exactly where he went. And through the brambles. Well, there are no brambles there. It's a forest now. But the brambles had jumped over the road to the other side. They lost track of him at that point. And then a couple hours later, they saw the sky was yellow with flames in the distance. And so they went to investigate. Sure enough, all of one of the neighbors' buildings were on fire. They weren't so advanced that though the neighbors who were around helped salvage some of the furniture. So they caught him. They caught him in an orchard, apple orchard, opposite, well, they went to investigate the fire, and then while they were there, they saw another blaze in the distance. They went and investigated that, and that was a Maxim burn. And then they rode on to Prosper, where there was yet another blaze. The next day, they found him in an apple orchard, which is now on the other side of the entrance of Wayside Road near that perennial garden place, about 2 miles from the Prosper Community House. They caught him. He had slashed his wrists, hoping to burn up with one of the fires, but he escaped, went to the apple orchard, and he told the authorities that they'd have to lock him up because he would no doubt burn again. So they sent him to the Brattleboro Asylum, and he died there less than 2.5 years later. And I've often wondered what he died of. I've been down to Brattleboro, found a record of his dying there, but there's no indication of what he died of. He had a sister who was also insane. Her name was Ida. She died 1889, and she died there at the Brattleboro Asylum. Just to point out the way the stones are arranged, here's Edward, the arsonist, Ida, who died also at the insane asylum, and his parents are here. See, they died later, but it's kind of touching because they're looking over, it's like they're looking over their children. This is a stone that commemorates a pair of infant twins that died before the rest. And this is the last surviving Shaw in North Bridgewater, E. Channing Shaw, which, and Frank Shirtliff could remember him. Back to the Thompson family. Kind of interesting here. George, infant son of Z and P. Well, there aren't that many Z's. There's Zadok Thompson, and then there's Zebulon Thomas. But as far as I know, those are the only names that begin with Z. And Zadok's wife's name was Phoebe, so that matches well. Apparently they had a child that died and is buried here. And he's buried with 2 cousins. These were cousins of George. So Zadok, who wrote this book, the History of Vermont, that was his son, and these are children of of Barnabas, his brother. Now we go back in the Thompson family. You get these interesting pairs of stones, husband, wife. One dies young. This is 1815. Actually, he wasn't that young in 1815. But here's his wife. She lived till 1839. Notice what a difference in the style of the stones. Here's that Baroque top, and this is a later Greek revival, or I don't know what you would call it. But the interesting thing here, mustn't forget this. This is Priscilla, was the wife of Noah Thompson, the first Thompson in North Bridgewater. And there's a little piece of her that still exists. And for these, I'm putting on a pair of gloves. This is part of her wedding dress. It's interesting to see it because it's almost like a hippie girl would, back in the 70s would have worn. But it's made of flax. She made it herself, and it still survives. And apparently there's another piece of this wedding dress around, as illustrated by this photograph. which Jeanette Sawyer provided for us. That just breathes a little bit of life into somebody who died 179 years ago.
I'm trying to remember, do you know if they were married here or if they married in Massachusetts before they came up here?
She was married in, I want to say 1760, which would mean they were married in Massachusetts. This is probably one of the most famous stones, probably the most famous stone in North Bridgewater Cemetery. It's of a Civil War soldier. Yesterday we had a little party at the home of some people who owned the cellar hole where he lived. And I was telling my wife, because there's an old road, just to kind of imagine his leaving to fight in the Civil War and his father taking him down on a wagon. This stone looks in great condition. Coleman Hoyt, who was head of the Cemetery Commission, indicated that this was in several parts, and he had to dig them up, and he had it restored. Also, there is a cast iron flag holder that was in several parts, and he had those welded together. So, and he did a beautiful job of preserving the stone. Isaiah Maxim's father is buried next to him. Interesting top of the stone. Nothing like what Abaya Shah would have had. Frank Shirley, that I alluded to, and I was acquainted with him. I don't know that I ever talked with him a whole lot, but he had visited Isaiah's mother. To know somebody who knew the mother of a Civil War soldier is quite interesting. She is not buried here. The story was she joined the Mormon movement and went west to Utah. And so she disappeared. And I remember talking with Jenny Shirtless' father, Irving, and apparently she was worth quite a bit of money when she went west. She was worth like $10,000, which is a lot of money in the 1890s or so when she moved. Another story about Isaiah's mother. This is the husband. They only had one child, as far as I know, and they didn't get along real well. Apparently the husband used to complain that she didn't have breakfast ready for him early enough in the morning. She got a little sick of this. This is a very early women's liver. And she told him that if he complained one more time, she was going to go to bed and stay there. She wasn't going to get up. No, she must have had to get up to go to the bathroom. But apparently she carried out her threat. And she wasn't about to get him breakfast anymore. So I don't think they got along real well. Similar problems today. Coleman Hoyt has put a nice marker at the south end entrance to the cemetery, as we can see here. This is a stone that's been there 20 years. Look at the condition of it. Covered with lichens already. I need to get out there, I guess, with a toothbrush and work on scrubbing it off. And this is what it looks like today, the cemetery. You've got the marble stones don't look that different from the slate. This is what it looked like 41 years ago when I took this shot. The marble stones were, for the most part, white. They had some, I suppose that's blue-green algae growing on these. Here's another shot And there's Alfred again. The Shaws are buried over in here. And that's what it looked like 41 years ago. A lot more white visible. Incidentally, this was the human burying ground. That was for animals over there. And that's the last of my slides. It's kind of interesting to look at some of the names. The family names were very familiar to us. Thompson, Atwood, Maxim, Moore. It's the first names that will blow you away. And I'll give you a list of what I came up with. Abiah, Adrastus, Annas, Artemus, Azahel, Azuba, Barnabas, Benoni, and there are several Benonis and several Barnabases, Bariah, Demas, Elihu, Eleazar, Electa, Elkanah, Enoch, Ephraim, Hosea, Jabez, Jerusha, Josephah, Lodoiska, Lovina, Mehetabel, Marson, Marcella, Chestina, Philandia, Seabury, Sella, Celindia, Thusi, Verline, Volney, Waitstill, and sometimes you had names based on virtues like delight, patience, and prudence. Wealthy was another one. Many different first names than what we know today. At one point, I had an interest in what one finds for plants in old graveyards. Of course, they grew a lot more things than what you see there now, but there are some plants that persist, lilacs being among the most common things one still sees. Of course, railroad lilies, alias daylilies, the common orange daylily you often see. Once in a while you find something really interesting that persists. In the Mendel Cemetery to the south has a dianthus that's been there, and I remember seeing it way back in the 60s. And I went back 10 or so years ago, and there it was still. And it had crept along the ground and formed part of the turf. And so I dug up a piece of that to propagate it, so I have some of that at home. I have a couple books on dianthus, and it matches something that called dianthus bridal veil. And it's a funny thing, because you think of a carnation flower, it has a calyx cup, and they're split out on one side and the petals fall out. And this was a very popular thing in the 19th century. Well, it's near some stones where somebody was buried like 1870. And I know it's been there since about 1962, and probably it goes back another 100 years. So that's the end of my talk. Does anybody have any questions? We'll take a short trip to North Bridgewater Cemetery after following. Yeah.
What's the purpose of a footstone?
You know, that's a good point. But and how common were they? Because a lot of them may have come missing over time. I suppose it marked where the head and the foot was, because after all, they could be buried from the headstones going that way or this way. It certainly would mark where the body should be found. There are depressions in that cemetery where there are east-west depressions, where I'm sure there are people buried, but there's no stone to mark them. Yeah.
Many of the old German graves, they have that footstone and that marked where the body was actually the
Sure,
coffin.
sure, that
Yeah,
was
so,
a common practice.
yeah, it was common practice, yeah.
Was there much difference in the cost between having a round, top rounded stone or one with the different designs?
Good question. I've got no idea. I suppose the more complex the stone, the more would have cost.
I didn't know if the men had more fancier stones than the women and they just got stuck with it.
The women have some pretty fancy stones here.
Okay. Thank you.
You talk about the burials were east-west
They
or
are-
north-south, and so
There
what
was
is
one, just one. that's
Yeah,
north
what's the
south.
significance of those directions?
Again, I can't tell you if there is any significance to it, but they at least had to be consistent in order to secure proper packing of bodies. Yeah, Peter.
As you look towards the headstones, you're facing east, more or less. Isn't that true?
Yes, that's right. That's right.
Perhaps it-
Yeah, that's right. Now that you mention it.
Perhaps it had something to do with sunrise and
Sunrise, you're facing the east where the sun rises? It could well be. Hard to know.
John, I have one reason I know about a headstone that has just the name on it and has 4 footstones. And the 4
Four?
footstones are individual people.
Oh, children.
Well,
Yes. One.
husband, wife, and grandparent and child.
One thing in North Bridgewater, some of those old slate stones have actually broken off at the base, particularly one grave of Elijah Walker and his wife, and they had 3 children, and I think it was a cousin of the children that died within a month. I don't know what waterborne disease was involved. I've been around the cellar hole trying to see, well, what was it they got into anyway. And but the children's stones have broken off, and they're just laying flat in front of the parents there. Yeah,
Where's that Shaw house you were talking about?
that's our house.
I wondered that.
Yeah. But we don't have a date on it. Imagine if you took it down beam by beam, you'd find a date someplace in it. But they had to live in something. The styles of the paneling and the moldings in it are simple. They're sections of they're quarter rounds or concave sections of a circle. Not like later federal building. And the paneling is deep paneling, and there's a pair of H hinges still in the house. Also, that sawmill had to be doing something, and there weren't very many people in that valley at that point. So I figured that it must be around 1786, 1787, but I don't have a firm date. But I've got the beams downstairs. They still have their bark. And they tell us what the species composition was that they were cutting anyway.
So you said you didn't come this way very much when you were growing up. So you went to school in Woodstock?
Yeah, just like you did. Just like you did. Didn't you go to school in Woodstock?
Well, not until,
Oh, not grade school, I guess.
yeah, not, yeah.
No, they tuitioned me out to Woodstock. I knew I was a troublemaker, so. Well, thank you for coming.